Hello, today is Monday, February 16th. Happy President's Day. And welcome to episode 558 of Fault Lines, the National Security Institute's podcast that gets you quickly up to speed 3 times a week on the national security and foreign policy debate shaking up America. I'm NSI Advisory Board member Lester Munson. I'm joined today by founder and executive director Jamil Jaffer and senior fellows Morgan Vigna and Jessica Jones. Folks, we're going to talk about events in Europe. Yes, I am talking about the curling scandal in which both the Canadian men's team and the Canadian women's team in curling are accused of cheating by Europeans. Of course, the Winter Olympics are taking place in northern Italy. We're talking about violations of the hog line and double touches, and there are swear words involved between the Swedes and the Canadians. The Swiss have gotten into the act. It's real. All right, I'm kidding. We're not here to talk about the Winter Olympics, but we are here to talk about events in Europe a little further north in Munich, Germany, where the Munich Security Conference, unlike most years, actually kind of made some news in the last couple of days. Our Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, gave a speech to the European audience. He got a standing ovation at the end, in which he described the very important relationship between the United States and Europe. We are partners. We cannot help but be partners. We have a shared culture, a shared history. America basically came from Europe 250 years ago. He traced his own lineage to both Spain and Italy. It was a rather profound and moving speech, I would say, for Secretary Rubio. He did a pretty good job. I'm and my fellow colleagues here on the podcast are starting to make faces. This is going to be fun. Morgan, I'm going to you first because you are the spiciest in the prep session for this. I was very impressed by Secretary Rubio's speech, and I thought it was fantastic. Maybe one, he could have mentioned democracy and human rights just once. That would have been helpful. He did not. Morgan, what's your assessment?
So I think we have to take a step back, Les, and understand the context in which Marco Rubio was going to Munich. I think a lot of the Europeans were still smarting from the Greenland debacle, of course, where President Trump has said we are going to own Greenland. And then, of course, he launched tariffs against our European allies for sending a handful of troops over to Greenland for a military exercise. That was truly jarring for many Europeans, and they have started to sort of fundamentally rethink the U.S.-European relationship and the future of NATO because of that. That hit them very hard. And so going into Munich, that is sort of the context in which I think a lot of our European partners were where their headspace was. Now, Marco Rubio, frankly, probably couldn't have given a better speech. But what I thought was interesting was the tone. And he said it right off. He's like, we are so hard on you guys because we care so much. We're tough on you because we value the relationship that we share, the common bond, the common principles and values and heritage that we share. Okay, that's true, but just understanding what we just went through, the Europeans are pretty scarred from this. And so Rubio was clearly standing up for Trump, for the MAGA agenda. He, hit on all the points that Trump cares about, including on migration, gave plaudits to the president. At the same time, this was a marked shift from last year's J.D. Vance speech, right? And so I think while the Europeans welcomed that tone shift, it was kind of interesting to say that for Rubio to just come in, saying, look, we care, but we're going to be tough on you because we care. And so I'll be interested to see how we follow up on that and what the European takeaways are from that.
Jones, last year, Vice President Vance gave a very harsh speech in Europe, complaining about our European allies, condemning them for not being more embracing their own right-wing politics, and for being exclusionary in that regard. Do you see symmetry here between Rubio and Vance, or is there a real fault line between these two important administration officials?
I think, we have the public side and the private side. I think the tone is obviously more welcome when it comes from the secretary, warmer. You talked about remarks on shared history, shared culture. But I think while the packaging is different, the message is the same, right? It's a message to the Europeans to get on board. We're in our second Munich into the Trump administration. And it looks like, to Morgan's point, I like to point out Morgan was talking about teaching her daughter a lesson this morning. And I think that message of, oh, I'm doing the best for you. I'm not sure her daughter cares if it's discipline, what the message and the tone is, right? It's the same. Thanks, Morgan, a mama moment. But I think the Europeans and the U.S. can kind of agree on one thing, and that's the alliance before the second Trump administration is fundamentally looking different right now. And the reasons that the Europeans and the U.S. think that is different, right? The U.S., the Europe probably, their take is the U.S. has been undermining the institutions of the alliance. They're treating allies not that well. We can talk about Greenland here. And the U.S. has been saying, we basically have been underwriting your security on the continent, right? And it's time for you guys to step up. The alliance didn't work as it was. Look at Ukraine and Russia, right? You couldn't do anything to stop that. So you need to step it up. And so I think, where we left now is, where does the alliance go? The secretary's speech laid out a few of the Trump administration's domestic agenda points, right? From migration to let's drop the talk about, climate change and climate initiatives, and let's focus on, culture and Western civilization. And it seems like, to get on the Trump administration's good side, European leaders need to take some steps on those fronts. And that seems like it's going to be hard for them to swallow. It might be antithetical to European leaders to make progress on those. But at the same time, even if the European leaders, take steps forward more in alignment with Trump administration's domestic viewpoints, I think if you get a card like Greenland, if the Trump administration wants to take Greenland, they're going to do it. It doesn't matter how close of an ally you are. It doesn't matter how many shared values you may come on board with. The Trump administration sees something that's in their interest, they're going to move on it. And so I think that leaves the Europeans in a very difficult place on where to move forward. And we see their talk about, strategic autonomy, developing their independent defense capabilities, even nuclear deterrence, like where do they go in the future, is very open-ended. But I guess if it's for tone, the secretary's speech is, much more welcome than Vice President Vance's of last year.
Jamil, it was 10 years ago when Poland started making changes to its judicial structure democratically and by law, and the European Union kind of went crazy on the polls and said, you can't do that, you're putting democracy at risk. And I have the feeling that what we're seeing now from Secretary Rubio and what we saw last year from Vice President Vance is a direct result of what the Europeans started 10 years ago, when they really started criticizing their own countries on this what is democracy question. Do you agree? And if not, contextualize this dilemma between Washington and Europe for us.
Yeah, I actually don't agree. I think this is what this is really more about, is a effort to get the Europeans to take more responsibility for their own neighborhood. Vice President Vance was very clear about that a year ago. Secretary Rubio reiterated that point here at Munich at the Security Conference. But it's also about this idea of how to bring Europe and the U.S. back together after, the beginning of a divorce that J.D. Vance triggered a year ago. And the interesting thing about the ground on which Marco Rubio wants to rebuild that connection is our shared civilizational values, and what he sees and what he reports to the Europeans as a threat to their civilization. And that is this problem of mass migration. And so in a lot of ways, what Secretary Rubio is doing is trying to analogize the U.S. situation on immigration to the European situation on immigration. And what's interesting is he found a very open audience there in Europe for that claim. And it was an audience that's not just the sort of right wing, the Viktor Orbáns of Europe, but the moderates in Europe as well. And so that's an interesting, basis to build this relationship on. Is, look, we may have our disagreements about who's going to do what in Ukraine and what we should do about Greenland, but where we can make common causes, we come from the same background, the same values, and we hate migrants. And so, I think it's really an interesting and potentially problematic place to begin. But I will say the Europeans felt like they felt a lot better about this speech than they did about the J.D. Vance speech. It wasn't just, I think, talking points. I was at a number of private dinners in Munich after the speech, and they reiterated the same points. So either they're all telling the same story and singing the same songbook, even though they hated the speech, or they really saw the speech as fundamentally different and more inviting because they've found a common cause to join hands with the U.S. on. So the real question now becomes, that's all great. Europe is on a path to becoming more independent, gaining its own defense capabilities, really sort of, growing up in that sense. The question becomes, can Europe keep its own cohesion together to do that? I'm not sure that's going to be possible. And number two, how soon can they do that, given that the U.S. obviously provides a tremendous amount of capability, and Europe has all sorts of laws and regulations and economic policies that make it very hard to grow and develop innovative new companies. And so we'll see how this plays out. But in the long run, I tend to think that the U.S. and the Europe can't beat China in the larger competition without one another. That we need to be joined at the hip. We need to be working together, and that means sharing a lot of things, and not just a common dislike of certain trends, migration, and a common bond of civilization, but also joint economic and military relationships. So I think NATO needs to remain strong, and we need to reduce tariffs and get back on the same page. But that also requires Europe to not be subsidizing all of its companies, which it has for decades.
Very interesting. And I totally forgot you were in Munich. And so that's a great firsthand view there, Mr. Jaffer. Thank you. Thank you for your pioneering spirit there and being willing to go to that important conference. I'll just say, I don't
know about pioneering. I mean, it wasn't like we were
an Olympian, Jamil. Like, good job. Yeah. You get a gold medal.
A cheating Olympian?
Did you do any curling while you were there?
There was no curling, but there was foosball. There's an annual Munich Security Conference foosball tournament. I did not play, but it's a thing.
Was it country against country?
It's delegation against delegation, yeah.
Foosball has a better argument that it should be an Olympic sport than curling, in my opinion.
One of our fellows, Mark Raimondi, and advisory board member Dmitry Alperovich was on the same team, and I did not witness it myself, but I hear they were very good.
I'm sure. Was drinking involved?
No comment.
All right. So before we get too far afield here, I'll just make the point that I think, yes, I agree on the security question. U.S. and Europe need to be together. I think on this political question about the way Europe has treated its own right-wing parties, whether we agree with those parties or not, Europe needs to include them in its democratic understanding. It needs to embrace the countries like Poland, which may make some adjustments, that the French or the Germans or the Belgians think is a little sketchy. They still have to embrace them. And when they don't do that, when they push them out, they create this schism that is a problem. And it does make it harder for us, particularly when we have similar trends here, to unite with them and have common cause. And so I think it's totally fair for both Vance and Rubio to be addressing this question.
But look, I don't disagree. I don't disagree less, but look, AFD, it's okay to be critical of AFD. It's okay to be critical of Orban. It's okay to be, critical of Le Pen and her crew, and her new selected leader. I mean, it's one thing to say bring the right in and allow them to have a place, but reform isn't conservative in the UK, and Nigel Farage is not the same as the Conservative Party, and so I think there's a delta between right-wing and reactionary, and it's okay to draw that line, just as in the U.S., we draw the line between Democrats and progressives, right? AOC is not...
You can and should have political debates, and people should be able to argue about those. You shouldn't push parties out of the system or push countries out because that party has done well there, which is what the Europeans were trying to do.
AFD is participating in the political process in Germany. Reform is participating in the political process in the UK. Viktor Orban is the president of Hungary. Like I don't know what you're talking about in the sense that ultra, or what you might call ultra right, the sort of the more reactionary parties in Europe are not they don't have a seat at the table. They have a seat at the table. In fact, they're winning seats in parliament.
The EU took specific steps to exclude Poland and judge Poland harshly.
That was a long
because
time
of changes to its judicial system. And a lot of this stuff has flowed from then. That was the beginning of this conflict between kind of the mainstream parties and these nationalistic right-wing parties. All right. One other quick point. It is President's Day. And we're comparing and contrasting speeches from two possible presidential candidates here in the United States in 2 years. So, folks, when you're thinking about Vance versus Rubio or Vance with Rubio, remember Vance gave a speech that the Europeans hated. Rubio gave one that the Europeans liked. Which one made the better play electorally to become the Republican nominee in 2028?
And does it matter what you say in Europe to the play to get elected?
Americans don't care what was said in Munich. Americans don't care what was said in Munich.
They don't care until they do, and on the margins, this stuff matters, my friends. That's a wrap. Thanks always to Kelly Crowley, Claude Jennings, the NSI staff, for the help in producing today's episode. Join us on Wednesday, February 18th for another episode of Fault Lines, the National Security Institute's podcast that gets you smart fast on the national security and foreign policy debate shaking up America. We're on YouTube. Check out our channel there to see our smiling faces. If you like what you heard or saw, be sure to rate, review, and subscribe.